All right, I think we can get started unless there are any objections. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the launch of Article 19's Targeted Report. My name is Amira, and I'm a board member of Article 19, and I'm going to be chairing today's call. I'm really, really happy that so many of you found their way here to, learn with us and speak with us about the ever-changing funding landscape and the impacts of the US funding cuts on freedom of expression worldwide. This is a really important point in time where not just the funding landscape is shifting, but the geopolitical situation is fundamentally changing. And some of the governments that we might have considered previously partners in the defense and strengthening of our rights and freedoms are now in some places unreliable, maybe at best, hostile at worst in some other places. And so us as, civil society, we find ourselves in a situation where we need to fight ever-growing threats with ever-shrinking resources. And it's with this in mind that I'm so pleased that we have our three speakers here today who will tell us a bit more about this. So first, we will have Claire Beston. She's the head of the Research Support Unit at Article 19, and she's going to be presenting the findings and the recommendations of the report, which we're launching today. Claire supports the design, implementation, and oversight of Article 19's research projects worldwide, and she has over 20 years experience working in this area, including with Amnesty International. After Claire, we'll listen to Feryel Charfeddine, who is the co-founder and executive director of CALAM, which stands for Coexistence with Alternative Language and Actions Movement, and which is a feminist NGO in Tunisia. And incidentally, or maybe not incidentally, CALAM also means speech in Arabic. And then we will hear from Shannon Maguire, who is the former Senior Media Advisor for USAID's Europe and Eurasia Bureau, and who's currently the Senior Director of Development at the International Center for Journalists. And Shannon has 25 years of expertise in grant making, democracy and human rights support, and oversaw a $300 million media development portfolio at USAID, directing and the design and the procurement of media strengthening programs. And she also briefed senior leadership across the US government on trends and challenges for independent media. I'm delighted that we have this super distinguished panel here today to speak with us today about this. After they speak, we'll have the opportunity to discuss your questions as well. And before I hand over to Claire to get us started, I also want to share a few housekeeping items with you. First, the session will be recorded. Second, we don't have a live captioner for the session. So if you need auto subtitles or anything like this, you can enable that feature in your, what is it called? In the Teams control panel. You can also use the Teams control panel to submit any questions that you have for the Q&A section later on. So you can do this at any time throughout the presentations. These questions will be collected in the background, and then they'll be answered in the last part of today's call. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to you, Claire, to get us started and present the report and its findings.
Thanks, Amira. The research for Targeted was carried out with the generous support of the Frit Ord Foundation to establish a clearer picture of the US cuts on the freedom of expression sector. The report provides a snapshot of the cuts and their impact and consequences for our enjoyment of our rights, for our societies and our democracies worldwide, and provides initial recommendations to inform conversations about where we go from here. So firstly, what was cut? Based on two spreadsheets given to Congress in March last year detailing State Department and USAID programs cut to that point, plus around 20 programs identified from news articles as part of another tranche of cuts in April, Article 19 identified 283 programs whose primary focus was freedom of expression related that had been cut to that point. These had a total value of $1.7 billion. That figure doesn't take into account where projects were at in multi-year life cycles, so some of that money will already have been dispersed and was not lost, while some were right at the start of multi-year programs. What it doesn't capture, which was repeatedly emphasised by interviewees throughout the research, was the extent to which freedom of expression components critically contributed to programmes across other sectors, such as health, conflict prevention response, electoral system strengthening, which often had substantial freedom of expression components delivered by freedom of expression actors, and therefore was also a source of funding. Because of this, and because programmes continued to be cut throughout the year, we believe this figure is likely to be an underestimate. The 283 programmes fell into four broad areas: civic space, independent media and media development, digital rights and internet freedom, and information integrity, with protection as an additional subsection of civic space. The slide shows the value of programmes cut from each of these areas. As well as the funding cuts on a range of issues, the change of approach and withdrawal of political support of the US government has been as detrimental as the loss of funds. And more widely, the leveraging of power and diplomatic pressure to the benefit of human rights has been withdrawn. This has not only left a massive hole in the backing for pro-democracy and human rights efforts globally, but the US now is a countervailing force against these efforts. Perhaps most critically, this includes redefining the concept of freedom of expression itself. It's important to note at this point that, of course, it's not just the US that's cutting its funding. These cuts were just the biggest and the most abrupt. Germany, the UK, Japan, France, and others all implemented cuts to ODA in 2025. Further, many governments are redirecting aid money to defence, which not only affects the funding landscape, it implies a seismic shift in global approaches to peace and stability. Excuse me. The cuts exposed persistent issues with the funding model. Large swathes of civil society was overly dependent on US funding. In some countries, the whole of civil society was almost entirely dependent on it, and also exposed a lack of progress on localization of funds. Only a fraction of the billions spent were reaching frontline organizations, often dispersed in very small amounts. The cuts also increased pressure exponentially on non-US donors to fill the gap, sustain support for current grantees, and make difficult decisions about what else to prioritize. Outside of government funding, the perfect storm of increased demand and depleted resources has reduced the availability of philanthropic support, while cost of living crises are also impacting individual giving. The research then went on to look at the impacts and consequences of the US's financial cuts and policy changes. The cuts have decimated civil society globally, from grassroots to international organisations to UN agencies. Swathes of critical work have been shuttered. Organisations have tried multiple tactics to mitigate the impact, including widespread layoffs, cutting salaries, avoiding work on sensitive subjects. Many organisations are now sustained by staff working with no salary, all of which, plus the significant uncertainty, has taken a severe psychological toll. Many organisations have closed down completely, with high levels of skills, knowledge, and expertise being lost. Smaller organisations have shown incredible resilience, but this has come at a great cost and is not sustainable, and donors and international organisations must not rely on highly skilled and qualified people working for free. Interviewees widely saw many more closures ahead. Civil society have focused on surviving, leaving them with less time and energy to work for the communities they exist to serve, but also no time and space for re-strategizing and planning for the future. At the same time, it is significantly more dangerous to be a journalist or a human rights defender now than it was before January 2025. Human rights defenders and journalists were already facing increased threats in the face of shrinking civic space and democratic backsliding. In that context, massive cuts were made to protection and support services that provided trainings, capacity buildings, emergency support, and among other things. Cuts to programs that equipped journalists and human rights defenders with vital digital security tools, including secure communication and surveillance circumvention tools, digital security training and support, including for activists in authoritarian countries, have also made human rights defenders and journalists less safe, while making it easier for hostile governments to target them and their organisations. Funding was also cut to work countering transnational repression, an ever-increasing threat to human rights defenders and journalists in exile, as well as to the national security of the countries where it's taking place. In some cases, these risks were exacerbated by the US administration's actions, such as releasing project and grantee information, and the rhetoric such as calling USAID a criminal organisation, which emboldened certain governments already hostile to civil society, and in some cases was used as a basis to further crack down, for example, in Serbia. Diversity and representation in policymaking fora have been hugely curtailed by the cuts. Multiple interviewees, as well as surveys and assessments, stated that in the face of vastly scaled back resources, external outreach and travel to events, policymaking for it, and even to advocacy opportunities at the national level, as well as the international and regional level, were among the first things to be cut. As a result, civil society is less able to meaningfully participate or even be present in decision-making spaces to promote human rights protections, represent communities, and advocate in the public interest. This has particularly affected representatives from global majority organisations, groups and communities who were already marginalised and underrepresented, reinforcing power imbalances and increasing the disproportionate influence of governments and the private sector. The current US administration's hostility and broad cuts to diversity programming have also severely impacted organisations headed by and or focused on the rights of women, the LGBTQI community, people with disabilities and other marginalised or vulnerable communities. 3 areas of critical work have been particularly hard hit. Civil society's capacity to monitor, document and report on human rights violations and local level threats, resulting in a sharp decline in reporting, especially from highly repressive contexts. Secondly, civil society's capacity to resist repressive legislation, such as the many examples of legislation restricting free expression and civic space, including online, that have proliferated in recent years. And thirdly, monitoring elections, disseminating election-related information, documenting and promoting accountability for violations in election contexts, as well as cuts leaving civil society more vulnerable to harassment and attacks in election contexts. Interviewees highlighted how the cuts and heightened risks are significantly accelerating a downwards trajectory for civic space, which had already shrunk over the last decade. Fundamentally, the impact of the US cuts adds up to a critical erosion of civil society's ability to provide essential checks and balances, to serve as a vital counterweight to the power and interests of government and the private sector, leaving those actors stronger and emboldened. Huge cuts to digital rights and internet freedom programs have massively weakened global efforts to counter digital authoritarianism, censorship, online attacks against rights, surveillance, and abuse. The cuts, coupled with in-demand skills, has precipitated the loss of staff and volunteers with deep expertise from the digital rights field, damaging the global network of interconnected skill sets built over many years on which much digital rights work depends. Civil society participation at key internet governance and digital standard setting, policy making and regulation spaces has decreased, with again disproportionate impact on global majority organisations which were already underrepresented in these spaces and often bear the brunt of the damaging uses of the technologies discussed there. The US has withdrawn its long-standing leadership of the push for a free, open global internet. The vacuum left by the seceded ground for authoritarian governments, particularly China, to push for a more state-centric version of the internet, risking the fragmentation of the global model into multiple internets, which would enable censorship, surveillance, and punishment of dissent. The future of the internet is currently hanging in the balance. The current US administration's strong opposition to regulation and corporate accountability, and the closer alignment of its digital policies with the economic interests of big tech than with the values of an open, safe, inclusive internet, have either precipitated or emboldened tech companies to weaken or abandon their efforts to protect free expression online. Coupled with cuts to groups advocating for rights-based approaches to platform regulation, supporting victims and fighting to hold big tech accountable and break its monopoly over digital markets, this means the digital space will become even more dominated by the government and private sector. The Open Technology Fund has supported tools and technology that help up to 2 billion people daily, including in the world's most repressive countries, to circumvent powerful censorship regimes, to access the uncensored global internet, access international news via technology like satellite datacasting, or to communicate securely. This technology has been central to much digital rights work and is critical to the security of digital rights and other activists, especially in highly repressive contexts. Its future is very much now in doubt. As a result, it's virtually guaranteed that digital and technology-based threats, restrictions, and attacks on freedom of expression and wider human rights will increase. Between 2020 and 2024, the US provided around 21% of all foreign aid for media support, which supported reporting, investigative journalism, capacity building for journalists and organizations, internet connectivity, and other initiatives. Financial and anecdotal sources indicate that the US has cut almost all funding for media, severely harming a sector that was already struggling due to failing market conditions, loss of advertising revenue, increasing authoritarianism, and other challenges. Shannon is going to talk in detail about the impact on the media sector, so I'll just outline briefly the findings of Targeted. Along with wider freedom of expression and civil society, the media sector has shrunk significantly as a result of the cuts, with widespread job losses, salary reductions, and multiple outlets shutting down altogether. For those that continue, coverage and content production is widely reported to have massively reduced as a result of the cuts. Journalists and media outlets are more vulnerable to self-censorship now due to the reduction of protection services, coupled with increased safety risks, and financially struggling outlets are more vulnerable to co-option if funding scarcity causes them to accept funds that constrain their editorial independence. Our research found that 4 areas of the media landscape were particularly hard hit. Investigative journalism, the loss of which will prevent media outlets from telling hidden stories, exposing corruption, holding governments and corporations to account. Local radio stations, a lifeline of news and other essential information such as on public health for people in rural and remote locations, especially in minority language areas and those serving marginalised communities. Media in countries that are highly repressive, in conflict or experiencing democratic backsliding, who are often highly reliant on donor funding due to the impossibility of income generation in such contexts. And media in exile, often the only reliable source of information for countries where government suppresses independent media. Cuts to the media will reduce the public's exposure to critical voices, create information deserts, and ultimately catalyse a surge in disinformation that threatens democracies everywhere. US-funded programs specifically targeting information integrity were broadly slashed in the cuts, in line with a change in the US stance on the issue. Interviewees in this research repeatedly emphasised the threat of harmful disinformation, including through foreign influence operations, flooding into the vacuum left as a result of the cuts to fact-based and reliable journalism, media independence, digital and media literacy work, digital rights groups, all of which work to strengthen information environments, leaving people everywhere with less access to accurate information. With democratically backsliding, repressive and conflict-affected countries, that is, the countries hardest hit by media cuts, the most likely to experience surges in disinformation. Interviewees in all regions expressed significant concerns regarding the ever-growing threat of malign disinformation in their country or region, particularly highlighting 3 areas of concern. Firstly, the significant risk that disinformation poses to the conduct of free and fair elections, including foreign influence efforts, but also in many cases domestically orchestrated election-related disinformation, which risk has been significantly increased by the US cuts to efforts to counter it, in conjunction with the cuts impacting civil society's capacity to monitor the conduct of elections and independent media's capacity to report accurately around elections. Secondly, concerns about the negative impact of rampant disinformation on action to tackle the climate emergency was frequently raised by interviewees. And thirdly, the impact of disinformation in conflict settings, including access to potentially life-saving information, particularly in Ukraine, for example, which I believe Shannon is also going to speak about. The cuts were a massive boon to authoritarian actors, especially China and Russia, who in multiple ways are filling the vacuum left by the US cuts. This was a pervasive theme throughout the research. Excuse me. Shannon will speak about the influence of Russia, particularly in Eastern Europe. The cuts have greatly benefited China's efforts to increase its influence and control of the information environment bilaterally and globally, as well as the US's withdrawal at the UN, ceding ground to China to influence processes according to its own priorities, for example, in bodies governing or regulating the internet or AI. Huge swathes of work that countered Chinese disinformation and interference in information environments were cut, including work to resist China's export of its cybersecurity norms and authoritarian approach to digital governance, especially in the Indo-Pacific region, cuts to diaspora organizations researching and reporting accurate information on China, cuts to Radio Free Asia that allowed China to take over broadcast frequencies, and loss of funding for work to counter transnational repression and support its victims, which is already having a chilling effect on activism in exile, all of which significantly reduce accurate reporting on China to counter official narratives. The increased financial precarity of organizations and media houses has rendered them more vulnerable to Chinese offers of funding or buyouts, for example, in Africa. A number of interviewees mentioned incidents of China immediately stepping in, offering to fill the funding gap left by the US. So the situation is undeniably grim. The world was already facing a free expression crisis. In 2025, autocracies outnumbered democracies for the first time in 20 years. The US cuts have exacerbated the crisis by weakening those on the front lines in the battle against creeping autocracy, stifling diverse voices and those advocating for rights, facilitating the proliferation of harmful disinformation, and constraining fundamental checks on government and corporate power. As freedom of expression underpins the safeguarding of all rights, the cuts to the sector weaken global protection of human rights in general. But there is opportunity in the current situation, and we as a sector must take it. But before we talk about that, I will hand over to my fellow panel members for their insights.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Claire, and thank you for such a comprehensive presentation. I think it'll take us all a while to digest this information. I really look forward to the questions that we're going to get from all the participants on this call. Now I'm really excited to hand over to you, Feryel, for some reflections on this from your perspective.
Thank you, Amira, very much, and thank you, Claire, for this presentation and for this output of the report. Actually, I think that for us as a ground organization, all start on 24th of January 2025, when we received an email to say that you need to cut all activity and any costs spent after this email. It wouldn't be covered by the funds. Actually, the ground is not like this international NGO that they have money. All our money comes from donors, and actually, let's say in our case, CALAM, with DRL, we have two big projects. The first one is on digital security for Tunisian feminist activists, and the second one, it was on the migration. So more than the impact of this cutting on the organization on itself, on our ability to do more security on the online, on our presences on the online, more it's more than have this restriction of being not able to recover our needs on digital rights, our needs on civic space, especially that Tunisia suffering of already shrinking of civic space from other perspective. I think, and I still thinking that the organization itself, especially the ground organization, we are lucky more than the beneficiary on themselves. We have privilege more than the beneficiaries, because I think that the cuts impacting the beneficiary, impacting the person that don't even know what happened in the other side of the world. I remember we had a victim. She was a trans woman, and she's supposedly to have our support because she was a victim of violence on the streets. And or let's say the majority of budget line that will cover her need was under USAID project. And when a cut happened, I remember that I couldn't say for a person in Tunisia that she don't know anything about what happened to the on the other side of the Atlantic, that someone signed a document, and the impact of this document is stealing your life, stealing on dangers. And you couldn't even say this because she don't know what's happened. She don't even know that there is someone uh, did this shit, excuse me. So I think that the most important thing are the beneficiary on themselves. The beneficiary that they don't know what happened in New York, or what happened in America. A Tunisian trans woman or a Tunisian victim with she's in Tunisia, she's in North Africa, and she wake up in the morning and she's impacted directly about the decision happened on USA. Something when I'm talking about this, it's unfair. It's really unfair and it's illogic, but still that's happened. So I think that the beneficiary suffer more than us as civil society, because we still have privilege as civil society organization. Even on the ground, we still have access to other donor to survive. We still have other options to survive, or to survive the organization on itself. But let's be clear, or let's be honest, the majority of some issues are not covered by other donor. And what was covered by USA DRL or USAID or whatever was very specific. Uh, so today, for example, it's very difficult to have a grant talking about digital rights, women digital rights in North Africa. It was easier when the deal was with DRL or with USAID or something else. Now it's very difficult. You couldn't find an European donor who believe, for example, of the reality of shrinking of civic space in Tunisia, with all of the restriction happen now in Tunisia. With DRL and USAID, it was easier. But still, as a civil society organization, we still have other options. But again, I think that beneficiaries, person on the street, person maybe they don't even know there is someone called Donald Trump exists in this world, impacting by cutting of money, impacting by lack of money, impacting by don't have money to help them. So it's true that this cutting, oh, sorry, it's true. It's true that the cutting, it's impacting us as a society, but I think that the impact of the cut is more important, and it's more deep on the ground on itself, with the beneficiary, with the person that they need more and more help than us, let's say. Sorry, Amira, if I spend more time, and I will stop talking.
Thank you so much. And thank you also for, bringing this kind of conversation and debate to the real stuff, right? Because we talk about this in like numbers and statistics and overseas development assistance and these institutions. And at the end of the day, this has such a real and kind of profound impact on your work in an organization, but then also the lives of those with whom you do work. So thank you for sharing this with us. And I look forward to seeing and hearing the questions that participants will have for you as well. But before we get to that, I'd like to hand over to you, Shannon, sharing your reflections from the heart of where all of this happened. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Amira. Thank you, Claire, and Article 19 for putting out this critical report and for inviting us to speak. As you mentioned, I was at the heart of it all. It took a tweet last year by Elon Musk to dismantle USAID. He wrote, "We spent the weekend feeding USAID into the wood chipper. Could have gone to some great parties, did that instead." It was a stunningly fast collapse of the world's premier development agency. And while much of the coverage has focused rightly on the humanitarian cost, this report in our discussion talks about a quieter casualty, the infrastructure that the US government helped build and support over nearly 40 years to support freedom of expression and independent media, defend the integrity of the information environment, and strengthen democratic resilience.
So in terms of impact, I'll talk about four main areas: information integrity, democratic backsliding and progress, exile media, and investigative journalism. Claire talked about FEME, especially from China. There was a recent report out by the EU on FEME, foreign information manipulation and interference, that was released last month. And that paints a pretty stark picture of where we are. In 2025 alone, the European External Action Service documented hundreds of FEME incidents globally, involving over 10,000 social media channels and websites. About 30% were linked to China, 30% linked to Russia, 6% linked to China, with the rest unattributed, but likely linked to both state actors. The use of AI in these operations grew by more than 250% in a single year. Funding for Russian state-controlled media is set to reach approximately 1.5 billion euros this year, 7% higher than last year. Moscow is scaling up, Washington is scaling down. So as the US seeks to shut down Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and other US Agency for Global Media entities, the Kremlin is increasing cooperation and content sharing agreements with foreign media outlets, distributing its narratives through third parties. In 2025 alone, Kremlin outlets signed new cooperation agreements with Bulgarian, Cuban, Bahraini, Malaysian, and Iranian media companies. What made the US contribution distinctive was not just addressing the content side, but funding the structural resilience. So the independent media outlets, satire and infotainment, investigative outlets, media, digital literacy work, civil society watchdogs, and human rights defenders, and the legal enabling environment that makes societies harder to manipulate in the first place. And while the report doesn't discuss this, USAID also provided robust support for social cohesion and rule of law programming, addressing the drivers of inequity, grievance, and distrust, the areas into which disinformation can drive wedges that find a sympathetic audience. That infrastructure is now gutted with the dismantling of USAID and the closure of the Global Engagement Center and the near closure of DRL. So we lost about 30% of the funding space globally in official development assistance. A second area of impact is countries in transition, whether that's Georgia and Serbia, where press freedom has declined precipitously. Media workers are facing violence alongside greater impunity, political smears, surveillance, ownership concentration, and legal restrictions. As this report points out, these local partners haven't just lost funding overnight, they now face government investigations and potential criminal charges. The damage is just as serious in countries that USAID called bright spots. Moldova, Armenia, Ukraine all showed democratic openings in recent years, and USAID's media programs were central to sustaining them. Media literacy reaching diverse audiences, programs strengthening financial viability against elite capture. We learned the hard lesson that without steady or even increased support, progress is hard to sustain. Moldova fought off an unprecedented wave of Kremlin-supported disinformation during its 2025 elections, and a similar playbook is now being deployed in Armenia ahead of the parliamentary elections in June. And then there's Ukraine. After the full-scale invasion, USAID supported more than 500 independent outlets, helped partners pass a law on media to meet EU candidacy criteria, provided thousands of bulletproof vests and protective gear, and enabled investigative reporting that exposed millions in corruption that diverted vital funding for that war. Much of that work is suspended. It was a $100 million program in Ukraine on media development at exactly the moment when it's most needed. A third area of impact has been support for exile media. In cases of sudden turmoil, Belarus in 2020, Russia after the full-scale invasion, Azerbaijan's growing authoritarianism, and increasingly in Georgia, independent media had no choice but to operate in exile. USAID helped exiled journalists keep reporting, exposing sanctions evasions in Belarus, money laundering schemes in Azerbaijan, and Russia's war crimes. But working and producing content in exile is incredibly volatile and resource intensive. Journalists face digital attacks, transnational repression, legal obstacles, and severe business and revenue challenges. USAID provided tailored, specialized support, emergency relocation, legal aid, professional mentoring, and business training. And this averaged about $10 million annually across these three countries. That expertise can't simply be replaced by a new donor writing a check. Finally, and perhaps most consequentially for long-term accountability, is investigative journalism. USAID viewed corruption as development in reverse, scaring away investors, deepening inequality, and fueling conflict. So we funded the journalistic infrastructure to expose it. From 2009 to 2025, USAID funded the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, or OCCRP, Over that period, OCCRP's reporting earned nearly 300 awards, contributed to seizing $10 billion in assets, and helped lead to nearly 800 arrests. For every $1 in U.S. funding, OCCRP returned $100 to U.S. taxpayers, measured in part by fines paid to the U.S. Treasury and Securities and Exchange Commission. OCCRP helped also grow local investigative reporting centers from 6 to almost 25 across Europe and Eurasia. Similar to Exile Media, investigative reporting is very resource intensive. Just to give you an example, one of the platforms that OCCRP runs cost about $30,000 per month for storage costs, and that can't be replaced. So I'll say in closing, what we all know, free, resilient, pluralistic media environment is not a luxury. It protects investments in health, education, disaster relief, and it's as essential to stability as any investment in defense or diplomacy. While free press alone doesn't guarantee democracy, there's no democracy without independent media. So when you lose as much as 25 or 30% of global funding for media development, the impact is profound and will ripple for years to come, particularly when we're talking about an already endangered sector in the face of increasing political, technological, and economic headwinds.
Thank you, Shannon. I really appreciate your sharing all this, knowing how close this was and still is to your personal life, your job, and kind of what you had, committed yourself to do within USAID. Before we go to the participants' questions, clearly there is like a big task ahead of us. And now we heard a lot about the kind of problems and the devastating impacts of the funding cuts on civil society, both at the kind of, like Feryel was saying, both for the kind of internationally operating ones, as well as those that are more focused in country. Before we go to the questions, I would like to hear from all three of you, actually. What do we do now? Where do we go from here, right? It would be maybe we start with you, Claire, based on that research, knowing what we know, what needs to happen now?
Thanks, Amira. Civil society, including independent media, is our best defense against autocratic resurgence, democratic backsliding, and the spread of increasingly insular nationalist politics and multipolarized geopolitical situation. The critical importance of supporting civil society at this juncture cannot be overstated. Within that, there is an urgent need to fund protection services so that journalists and human rights defenders are safe and protected to conduct their essential work, and to support and fund representation and participation-related activities to maintain a diversity of voices and ensure the inclusion of the interests of everyone in decision and policy making, not just those of governments and the private sector. But at the same time, there is now an opportunity for donors and civil society alike to build back better, stronger, more strategic, and more sustainable. The redrawn landscape provides the impetus, but also the opportunity to make genuine progress on shifting resources and power to the global majority, to identify and support broader sources of leadership and knowledge, ground programs in local priorities and solutions and ownership, and also promote the engagement of a wider constituency of people and communities to build the movements that must be part of our response to the new global order. A lot can be achieved with less money through more strategic, more flexible and responsive funding that goes directly to local organisations and supports different types of actors with a willingness to undertake a higher level of risk while lowering the burden of reporting so that local organisations can receive more funds directly, and through providing the core funding that enables civil society to develop, strengthen and grow. For civil society, in the face of vastly reduced resources and an entirely altered global landscape, civil society also has to reorganise, reimagine, and emerge more strategic with approaches suited to the challenges ahead. NGOs, large and small, need to undertake robust self-reflection exercises to identify their strengths and their most important contributions to a wider ecosystem of free expression civil society, to scrutinise interventions and ways of working that are most impactful, have had limited impact, or are no longer fit for purpose. We need to consider what role we want to play, and for larger organisations, how we can better support smaller organisations and build better partnerships with frontline civil society and communities. This will enable civil society to emerge more strategic, focused and efficient, and will also be a necessary foundation on which to build the greater collaboration, which is essential, not only in the face of reduced resources, but also in order to catalyse greater impact, and will be fundamental to civil society reorganising to fight back against the forces ranged against us. This enhanced collaboration should include more sharing of knowledge and successful strategies, tools that have been impactful that can be replicated in other contexts, and critically in coordinated advocacy. For example, where multiple organisations are addressing the same target, coordination in both message and delivery will exponentially increase impact while avoiding duplication, contradiction, or dilution. But also at a much larger level, there is a real hunger, this research showed, and previous research has showed as well, there's a real hunger widespread in civil society for greater interconnectedness, wider collaboration, learning and sharing, building coordinated movements and global solidarity across regions and across sectors. This approach will enable more holistic, interconnected responses to the interconnected issues that we're seeking to address, such as excessive corporate power, the climate emergency, and democratic backsliding, and is also the antidote to an increasingly insular world. In taking this approach, it is also essential that we engage a wider constituency of people. In order to support this adaptation to the new reality, donors should support civil society in the processes of re-strategizing and reimagining in the immediate term, invest in research, development, and pilot projects to explore what works under the New World Order, including how to build effective movements, how to respond effectively to new and rapidly evolving threats to human rights. And donors should create multi-donor, multi-state, cross-sectoral funding mechanisms to support human rights ecosystems, movement building, and a wider range of actors. Thanks.
Thank you so much. This really resonates, I just recently transitioned out of Luminate as the Director of Global Programs, and I think there was something about kind of funders always knowing that core funding is better, flexible funding is better, kind of supporting at the ecosystem level is better. And it seems like now the signals for this are so loud and so imperative in a way that I think there is a lot of awareness now amongst kind of funding organizations, knowing that in this critical moment of time, it's really important to support kind of network movement approaches and support ecosystems as a whole. So thank you for highlighting this again. Shannon, maybe you want to go next with, what do you think, where do we need to go from here?
Sure. And I know, many of us have been in these conversations so much. So I don't want to minimize, what so many of us are still sort of grieving and what's been lost. I very much recognize this, but, at the same time, we do need to look forward to see how to rebuild and reinvent. So I think this report and there's also a new report out recently by Carnegie that have specific tangible ideas when it comes to recommendations. So in the interest of time and based on what Claire was saying, I'll just focus on 3 areas: radical collaboration, shared infrastructure, and genuine commitment to localization. When it comes to radical collaboration, we talk about it constantly. We often do it badly. So there's hundreds of support organizations doing overlapping work, competing for the same resources, duplicating tools and approaches, and we just can't afford to do that anymore. So radical collaboration is more than just being in a working group or a coordination call. It's organizations genuinely pooling capabilities, sharing risk, and building things together that none of them alone could build. So I'm now at ICFJ Plus, which is a new joint organization formed by the International Center for Journalists, Code for Africa, and Proto. We're 3 organizations that could have remained separate, competing for the same funding, but instead we've combined journalism expertise, civic technology, and systems building capacity into something genuinely new. We're sharing governance, risk, and a commitment to delivering at scale in a transformed information environment. Our goal is to cultivate civic intelligence, so helping people break through information overload, make sense of their world, and act constructively to shape communities. So as part of this collaboration, this leads into a second area of recommendation, which is shared infrastructure. So the USAID collapse didn't just cut project funding, it really cut the connective tissue. So when we're talking about the news and information space, these are tools and platforms that small and medium outlets depend on, but can't afford individually. Things like market research, audience development, publishing stacks, revenue strategies, integrating AI automation, workflow, and tools and processes into their work. So ICFJ Plus's new initiative, Plus Hub, is designed to give news providers access to shared enterprise level services. This frees up limited resources to do what they do best, which is informing their communities and providing what we call news you can use. Partners aren't just dealing with knowledge gaps, but resource gaps. So this is a fundamentally more efficient use of funding, the scarce funding that we do have left, and frees up assistance for other core funding costs. And then the third and final point that I want to talk about is localization. And Amira, you mentioned this. So reports by the Global Forum for Media Development, Deutsche Welle, Academy, the new one by Daniel Sabin and Susan Abbott for Carnegie, talk about how much funding actually reached local media organizations. They found it was somewhere in the range of 30 to 40% of ODA that reached local grantees directly. It's not just about the percentage of money going directly to local organizations, although that does matter enormously. But localization also means co-designing programs from the start with local partners, not presenting them with a pre-built framework and asking them to implement it. It means ensuring that program leadership reflects the communities being served, so not just the staff on the program. It means training and mentoring models are driven by local experience and local contexts. And it means recognizing that short-term project-based funding makes long-term planning difficult. Core institutional funding is a major missing piece, as you mentioned, Amira. And that complexity the complexity of application systems systematically favors larger organizations with grant writing capacity over those with the strongest public interest function and the deepest local roots. These recommendations aren't new, as you said, Amira. We've been talking about them for years. In fact, the OECD Principles for Relevant and Effective Support to Media, which were published in 2024, we have these clear frameworks. So the question is whether we use them as a baseline for accountability or just as a pledge on the website. So the funding gap is real, but the habits that we had before the gap, competing organizations, top-down funding, chronically underfunded local partners, this created a fragility that this crisis is really now exposing. So the path forward is not to restore what we had. It's building something more resilient. Radical collaboration, shared infrastructure, and genuine localization are not idealistic aspirations. They're practical responses to the constraints we're operating under. And again, things that we've been talking about over many years, many documents. So that's what we need to do next.
I'm so glad that you mentioned these three recommendations, and what you said about localization. I almost want to go one step further, because you talked about kind of genuine co-design, but I think especially now at this point, it's really important not just to collaborate with partners who work in country focused on like national context, but actually follow the lead of those organizations that have worked in such environments for much longer than a lot of organizations in the global North and West, who are now sort of at times, right, a bit taken aback by the changing funding landscape, etc. I imagine organizations working in Tunisia, working in Egypt, where I'm from, and other places, they have so much experience dealing with volatile funding, volatile political environments. And so there is some like real leadership that comes out of various places in the world, and that hopefully organizations that work across regions can really benefit from as well. And so I really appreciate you mentioning this and highlighting this, Shannon, about kind of collaborating really meaningfully across different types of organizations. So before we go to the group questions, I will hand over to you, Feryel. And because I cut you off a little bit early by mistake before, I will be quiet and you speak as long as you want, but no longer than 5 to 7 minutes, okay? But as long as you want. So I will be quiet and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Amira. Anyway, it's okay. Actually, let's be honest, these 4 years or 5 years will be very difficult for anyone. And it's very important to know that, or as let's say, as civil society organization, as the person working on the ground and on the front line, let's say that we can see that that's can happen. And if it's happened now for American funds, tomorrow no one know which funds could be cut. So for this, I think that we need to have a reflection about what economic model we need as an organization on the ground, how we can get money from anything, from from social project, from social activities, or whether it's time to think directly and literally what economic model we want. And now I think that we see that this economic model based on donor fund, it's not, it couldn't be safer anymore. We see that's very risky. We couldn't put all our hopes, all our victim lives, or our victim stories on this situation again. So I think that we need now to talk about what economic model we want. And I think that some reflection on that started already. And we don't have 100 shows. We don't have excuse me, we don't have 100 options. So we need to know that we need to have projects, corporate project, to finance our work on the ground. That's it. It was very short.
You finished early, even, thank you for mentioning this and these kind of thinking about what are alternative ways in which we can fund our work, where we are less both financially and politically dependent on those who provide the funding to us, right? You mentioned working with corporate funders. There are very interesting initiatives happening around kind of income generating activities for some organizations, as well as diasporic fundraising for organizations that work in country, and so on and so forth. Knowing that the kind of big grants, the substantive amounts of funding still come from those institutional funders, bilateral, multilateral, as well as private philanthropy and so on, right? Thank you all so much for sharing your vast knowledge and wisdom with us. We are now going to do the Q&A and go through your questions. I'm reminding everybody who's on this call, if you haven't submitted a question yet, you can use the Q&A function on your Teams control panel to submit your question. And if we don't get to your question in this call, we'll be very happy to answer it later via email and so on. This is not the end of a conversation. This is the beginning of a conversation, and we really look forward to engaging with all of you on this. So I will be quiet now, and I'll hand over to you, Claire, to guide us through the Q&A.
Thanks, Amira. Okay, our technical team have been sending me some of the questions that have arrived so far. So I'll just make a start with those. The first question is, we've talked about the impact of the cuts on freedom of expression in general, but could you also speak to how those funding cuts are affecting people who are employed in this sector, particularly job security and mental health, working on freedom of expression? Many are struggling in silence. Did the research look at that? So the report did look at that, and it touches in various places on the psychological impacts of the cuts, particularly relating to how abrupt they were, the loss of work that was deeply cared about, the uncertainty of the future of organizations or the sector, or even the issues facing the societies of the interviewees, coupled with the heightened security risk that I spoke about. Interviewees, so a number of interviews, including some are quoted in the report, said that they were considering having to leave the sector because of them basically to protect their own mental health. That is definitely widespread. And among the recommendations in the report, it does recommend that investing in civil society has to include investing in the well-being of civil society. I wonder if, Feryel, this is, I'm sure, very close to your heart, if you want to add anything to that on the mental health impact of the cuts for the sector.
Thank you, Claire. Absolutely. I think that we are double harming when you talk about mental health of the person working on the organization and on the job impacting by this case. First of all, because you feel that your job is in danger. So you have this charge on you that I will lose my job, I will lose the money that I can live. Plus, your mental health also will be impacting when you see the feedback of the beneficiary. And you see that you couldn't do anything for the beneficiaries and for people that you help it, sorry. So yes, and I think it's very important to talk about the mental health of the person working on the sector, because we always talking about cat funding and the impact, the financial impact on that, but a mental charge, a big mental charge is there, also a big mental charge impacting you, impacting your work, and even impacting the strategy of the organization, and impact your vision of what the vision of the sector itself, if it's worth it what you are doing or not. So yes, I think that it's very necessary to talk about our mental health, and it's very necessary to talk about the impact of all this on our mental health.
Thank you, Feryel. Okay, the next question is, how can independent and mainstream media in the US, I think this is for you, Shannon, perhaps, how can independent and mainstream media in the US, which are also being targeted now, shed more light on some of the damage that has been done? What angles do you think must be highlighted? Impact on investigative journalism, for example, how this work protected societies from election interference, for example.
I think, and actually there's only so much time for remarks, but one of the things that I wanted to mention actually was something that there was a piece recently by John Oliver, who hosts a weekly show on HBO, and it was about the dismantling of USAID, and it was a really thoughtful, it was just a thoughtful piece on the dismantling of USAID, how it happened, why it was able to happen so quickly, and what it means and the impact of it. So I think, reaching different audiences through things like that, whether it's satire, infotainment, or, reaching maybe more audiences that keep up more with international news about the impact, why it matters, is important. Reaching audiences where they are, not where you want them to be, but where they are. So I think mainstream media did an amazing job at the beginning, covering what was happening and what the impact was. And there have been Nick Kristof, for example, has been on the New York Times. ProPublica have really been on, and DevX have really been covering the ongoing impact. So not just what happened in the first few months and the overnight pulling of assistance, but have followed ongoing impact. And also, I feel like they've done a pretty good job, but we need to keep bringing this home about the preventative nature of what USAID did in terms of preventing disaster, humanitarian, conflict, war, all these other things that we worked on. The prevention aspect is so much less expensive than reacting to a crisis or reacting in the aftermath. But I do think that message has gotten a little bit lost over time, a little diluted over time, and I think that's something that media in the U.S. can cover a little bit better, but also making that link of the interconnected world that we're in, and how this does not make America safer, stronger, or more prosperous. In fact, it does the opposite, but providing examples exactly of why and how. So it's being covered to some extent, but it still needs to be covered a little bit more in depth. And again, reaching audiences that aren't always getting this information as much as they could or should.
Thank you, Shannon. The next question is, are there ongoing multilateral programs or initiatives that can help cover the funding gaps? For example, the International Fund for Public Interest Media, Lighthouse Defenders for Human Rights Defenders, emergency funding, other diplomatic initiatives by groups of countries like the Freedom Online Coalition, Partnership for Information, etc. Feryel and Shannon, if you want to add anything, you might know more about this than I do, but I was aware through this research, certainly, that there are ongoing multilateral programs. One that springs to mind was a large project, one of the biggest, possibly the biggest, I don't remember, for protection of human rights defenders, the Lifeline program. The US withdrew its funding from that, but it was actually funded by a basket of donors. And after the cuts, they came together, and I don't know if they completely filled the gap from the US, but they definitely filled some of it and put more money into that fund. And another thing that came through in the research was the move towards these sort of multilateral programs, the benefits of doing so, including the dispersal of risks to donors who are somewhat risk averse, which also then enables maybe the funding of a wider diversity of actors. Whether they can help cover the funding gap, I'm not in a position to say that, because I don't know about their resources or their strategies or intentions, but there are certainly some that are ongoing. And I think the benefits of that model are being more and more sort of widely supported and taken up. Feryel and Shannon, did you want to add anything on that question about multilateral programs or initiatives? Shannon, I'm sure you know loads of them from your funders history.
Well, I think that the person who asked the question did mention, IFPIM, the International Fund for Public Interest Media. But Claire, I don't know if I have much to add. I mean, there, we are seeing these pooled donor funds. Not that that's not necessarily a new thing, but I'm pleased to see a lot more of them. It shares risk, of course, but then it also shares resources. So I am heartened to see more of those being advertised, and that's important. But I again, though, I do have to stress, I mean, we were talking, if it's the media development space, it was about 25% of ODA just in media development that was cut, and probably similar, maybe even more if we're talking more broadly for freedom of expression. So that is very difficult to make up. But things like these pool donor funds that are getting, especially like just direct funding to local organizations, are going to be more important than ever.
Absolutely. Next question is, how do you get away from the fragmentation that made the previous funding system so dependent on a single, generous, if occasionally problematic, funder? My fellow panel members, if you want to come in on that, from the perspective of the research, I would just say that it certainly came out very strongly as a recommendation, the need for not only civil society to be much better coordinated and collaborate more closely, but also for donors to do so. And so that is another aspect, I think, of donors looking to fund differently going forwards that has been a kind of recurrent theme throughout this webinar. Anything that you'd like to add, Feryel or Shannon, on that question about getting away from fragmentation that created a dependence? Actually, maybe I'll just roll in. Sorry, Shannon, I was going to roll in the next question, but carry on.
Oh no, well, I'm just curious, Feryel, to hear from you, because I mean, this is something we talk about a lot, like, and that comes up as a recommendation, and I just would love to hear from you, like how realistic is that? Like, that's hard, right? To try to get it. I mean, that's always the gold standard, is trying to get a diversification of funding, but it's hard, right?
Actually, yeah, it's hard. Second, we don't have this magic receipt to fragment the funds. And it's literally depends of your agenda as an organization, also what you want to do, and from any I mean, like, where you will get the funds. But actually, again and again, I think that special after what's happened and after the cuts, I have this convention now that we shouldn't talk anymore about fund. we need to have another economic model. It's clear that it's not the safe way. It's clear that it's very short-term solution. Let's deal with the very short-term solution with very different perspective, having multi-funding from multi donors or whatever. But let's be honest and let's make in our mind that it's literally a short-term solution. We need, if we want to work on the ground, if we want to have more impact on the long term, we need another economic model to let's say to work. Any other solution linked to the donor, have multi donors, have less funds from X, have more funds from Y. I think all these are a short-term solution and not very deep solution.
Thank you so much, Feryel. The next question is actually quite connected to that question. It says, looking back, it looks like global civil society as a whole and each civil society organization individually did not see this risk coming. Two questions. Was this not sheer collective and individually massive failure of the governance of these CSOs for not seeing this level of risk? What can we learn from a governance responsibility perspective moving forwards? I would say from the findings of this research that there was that very much a widespread feeling that this was a very abrupt wake-up call, that everyone had almost sleptwalked into massive dependence on one donor across the sector. So there is a lot of reflection happening within civil society everywhere about how that happened and how we got to that point. I think that in terms of the second question, what can we learn from a government's responsibility perspective? Everybody is thinking about that question. I found that very widely among interviewees in this research, that it now has given that sort of wake-up call that, as Feryel was saying, everybody is thinking about very different economic models, very different economic generation activities, not only because there's now an imperative to do that because their resources have been so massively scaled back, but also to be more sustainable, to be more grounded in the communities that they work with or aim to serve. And so this is part of, I think, that transition that I was talking about in terms of the recommendations, that civil society broadly everywhere are looking at how we move to different models, what those different models are and how we get there. Shannon or Feryel, do you want to add anything on, was it a massive collective failure, and what lessons do we learn from that about governance responsibility?
Actually, I want to say, because that's right, how the civil society organization, we don't see this level of risk. I think that no one could have this clear vision to know that something like this will be happen. I mean, like we can't talk about that can be happen, but step by step, and not directly, not on one shot, if you can say. And I think that no one, literally no one, could be able to know that's can be. But I think that it's true, it's very difficult situation, but in the same time, that help us to think collectively, and that's help us to say that nothing is guaranteed. So, and also I think that, that's help us to work also with what the meaning of risk. Sorry, what the meaning of risk and how we can deal with the risk. So again, I think that no one was able to know this decision will be on one time, 1 second. Second thing that again and again we need to have long-term solution. I don't know why, how, I don't know the receipt, if you can say, but I know that we need very long decisions and a very and solution on the very long term.
One thing I'll just say from my perspective about what happened and that we should have been more prepared maybe is just taking a step back. Like in 2016, in November of 2016, when Trump was elected the first time, December of 2016, Congress actually passed two major things. One was something under the National Defense and Authorization and Appropriations Act that expanded the mandate of the Global Engagement Center, and then also passed what's called the Countering Russian Aggression Bill, which created current time under U.S. Agency for Global Media and increased funding to address Russian disinformation especially in Europe, Eurasia. So for Europe and Eurasia, for our bureau, funding actually increased under the first Trump administration, which was not expected. And why did that happen? That was, Congress stepped in and passed funding. So this time around, I, wasn't naive. I certainly didn't think budgets would increase for USAID. And I had sort of quietly been thinking, okay, if we have to cut programs, or if we have to downsize, this is, kind of, this would be my plan or my suggestion for how we can do it. But I thought we had a year. I really did. I thought we had at least a year to kind of help with the planning. We had already obligated funding, as Feryel knows, like obligated funding to local organizations on the ground, to implementing partners. Most of it had happened in September of 2024. So the funding, we thought at least that was safe. That was there for a year. We have a year to plan and to figure out next steps. And I mean, no one would have predicted that Congress did nothing to stop this. Absolutely nothing. It was absolute chaos. I mean, I'll tell you that weekend when Elon Musk sent that tweet and we were locked out of our offices that Monday morning, Tuesday, some Democratic members of Congress came and tried to kind of push through the door. It was chaos, and it was created by these young 20-year-olds who were part of DOGE. It was astonishing what happened, how quickly it happened, and how little resistance and pushback there was. And that's just not something that could have been predicted. But I do think we, many of us on the inside were ready to adjust and make changes over at least the course of a year, which is still quite fast. But just to be fair, I mean, no one plans for that overnight. 20%, of funding lost overnight, of global ODA lost overnight.
Thanks, Shannon. And again, our sympathies to all of you who went through that deeply traumatic experience. Actually, I'll skip to a question that's related to that and then come back to the next question. This was a question primarily directed for you, Shannon. And it relates to what you were just saying. If you had known that USAID funding was time limited, how would you have changed the strategy to ensure that what was invested could survive post-funding? Should remaining donors also build strategies based on the possibility that their funding may also be time limited, and what would that look like?
This is a tough question. I mean, I have the answer. It's tough to share. But so, I think the portfolio that I oversaw, it was quite robust. It was about $300 million, and that's in bilateral programs and regional programs. That is over the course of 5 to 7 years. So when I say 300 million, that was like the total envelope. And 1/3 of that was Ukraine, was the media program in Ukraine. So that was quite a bit. I think, in terms of priorities, so USAID, we had the luxury, because it was so robust, we had the luxury of funding things like research, funding things like media literacy efforts. And so there were some areas that, could sort of say, okay, program like Ukraine, that needs to stay in place. It is saving lives of journalists. It is saving lives of the people who are consuming their information and need to get accurate, timely information about the full-scale invasion. So things like that were a no-brainer in terms of what to try to, shifting resources or having to downsize. What I would have proposed be prioritized. Things like exile media, where it's just not impossible, but it's so difficult to get other donors to support exile media, or for any kind of business model, frankly speaking, to help diversify their revenue sources. So things like that I would have prioritized. And then I mentioned investigative journalism. Absolutely would have prioritized that. To me, as I mentioned, and this was something Samantha Power, Administrator Power, would say, corruption is development in reverse. It just reverses all other gains that you're making in terms of international development. So investigative journalism is really critical to shining a light on fraud, waste, and abuse, and transnational corruption. So we definitely had priority areas that I would have proposed for us to continue supporting, and then things that could have been downsized, or if I had to phase out. But those probably would have been those were the areas I would have proposed the most for Europe, Eurasia, since that was just my geographic remit.
Thank you so much, Shannon. The next question is, what concrete changes are needed to make genuine localization a reality rather than a principle? Which, of course, is absolutely the crux of it, that we can talk about these principles, but now our job of work as society, civil society, and as donors is to really make them happen much more effectively, as we all spoke about. And we've all spoken about this at various points, but if we want to add anything on that, and Feryel, I'd love to start with you, from your perspective of what you feel are the concrete changes that can make localization more of a reality.
That's a very difficult question. I mean, because on somehow that we work to have change on the ground. So actually, what we can do to make impact on the reality, or to see the change, I think, again, I'm feeling that I'm repeating myself, but I think, again, that we need collective reflection, we need a collective strategic work, we need solidarity between civil society organizations to know the real path and to know how we can concretize our principle on the reality with very challenging, let's say, very challenging point, which is the financial point. Because to be honest, like let's say it, we need money to the impact. We need money to help people. We need money to try to concretize our strategy, our dreams, our objective. So I think that Claire. I think again and again that there is some discussion that civil society are avoided since years. A discussion about what we are doing, what's our impact, how we can be very solidary, and we can talk about networking with civil society, how we'll not double the work, and how we will work together. So this discussion, how we can and including the funds, including the financial aspect. So I think that we need the civil society organization and the ground organization need to talk, to do this reflection. And I feel that we are avoiding this reflection since years, but now with this new structure, with new restructure, it's a must. So again, behind the money, behind the dollars, behind what you want, we need a reflection, because it's very important also to know that we need money, that's true, but more important than money, we need a strategy who concretely the risk of having money from donor X or Y.
Thanks, Feryel. Shannon, I know you spoke about localization in detail in your recommendations. Is there anything that you would add to that?
I think maybe the only thing to add is, so before I was at USAID, I was at the National Endowment for Democracy. And while I was at USAID, I also worked a lot with EED, the European Endowment for Democracy. I think those models are really, they're like best practices. I mean, they have, or at least with NED, 3 open calls a year, tied to dates when the board meeting meets. It's a really clear, defined process. It's anyone can apply. It's really grassroots, locally driven in terms of imperatives and things that NED supports. Their staff are based in Washington, so keeping costs down. They don't have field offices yet. They do get out to the field to meet with local organizations on the ground, either existing grantees or potentially prospective grantees. That's really important, and it's quite a low it's a low burden in terms of the application for NED, for example. And I'm seeing more donors move to maybe 2-stage applications where there's a more simplified concept note. Some donors are also even pooling together a common application form that's a much lower burden for smaller local organizations. That I think is absolutely a best practice. And also, as I mentioned, some large donors, there's only so much you can do if you're a large institutional government donor. But things like what the EU has been doing with FSTP, financial support to third parties, requiring a certain amount of a percentage of funding that must go under a large tender to local organizations. There's ways you can do it with smaller organizations, but smaller donors, and then larger donors, where you can build that in and ensure that localization is part of it. It's never going to be perfect.
Thank you, Shannon. To that, I would just add from my side that localization is also for international NGOs. It's not just for donors, because it's about shifting resources, which international organizations have ways that they can look at doing. There are various suggestions I've seen, like making contributions to a pooled fund that can then support local organizations, but it's also about shifting power as well. So it's also about different, as I spoke about, different types of partnership, being better partners or more equal partners in things. But another aspect of it is on the donor side to ensure that money for the processes necessary for localization are included in project budgets. And I know that's very difficult when resources are very short and everything is starved of money, but it will, ideal would be that it saves money in the long term, investing in the short term in ensuring that those processes can happen to, for example, ensure the tying of programs to local priorities and solutions and local ownership of programs and so on. We're running close to time. I think we've got 2 more questions we're going to try and squeeze in. The first one is, we talked about how the cuts increased the influence of China and Russia, for example, and created space for increased repression by such countries. But the question is, how do we see the cuts affecting the behavior and accountability of key US allies, particularly Israel, given that it ranked highest in journalist killings in 2024 and 2025? The report didn't look at the impact on US allies. It did, as I mentioned briefly earlier, certainly the change in stance of the current US administration has emboldened big tech companies to actions that are counter to the protection of freedom of expression globally. But also the key impact of the cuts in relation to that is that they have massively damaged global efforts at accountability in terms of the monitoring, documenting, and advocating for accountability role of civil society that I spoke about earlier, the weakening of the UN human rights system, which we didn't have time to cover, but has been massively impacted by the US cuts. and in a range of other ways. So certainly efforts at global accountability will be even more difficult than they already were, which, let's face it, was already a huge challenge. I will just then go on to the last. I think this might be our last question because we're running very close to time. The USAID cuts have created a ripple effect where other institutions and other donors that are still engaged pivoted towards security and defense priorities rather than soft power, making aid and development budgets contingent on tangible results. Did we miss a trick in the sector in how we present the result of our work? Is there a better way to convey the importance of press freedom and information integrity in a way that would be understood by the new transactional approach that is materializing? I'm going to say one very quick thing on that. And I think that's the second part of that is absolutely right about the importance of conveying the critical role of freedom of expression and independent media. I think we all feel as a sector that we haven't done a good job of communicating that to a wider constituency of people over the last recent decades, and it's absolutely critical that we do that going forward, that we focus among other things on how we communicate the relevance and critical role of that sector. I don't think that we should adopt the transactional approach. I think we have to be counter to that, as I said in my recommendations, and take different approaches. But certainly we need to make the case better. We need to communicate better, and we need to use hope-based communication as a key way of engaging a wider community of people. In 1 minute, Feryel and Shannon, would you like to make any final comments on that before we wrap up?
First of all, I want to thank you, Claire, thank you, Amira, thank you, Shannon, thank you, Article 19, and all the person that continually heard for us for more than 1 hour and a half. Actually, again and again, maybe having ground based on donor money, it's not enough guarantee. We need another perspective. We need another alternative to change the life of people around us. And thank you very much again.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for hosting this. Yeah, I think we've talked for many years about how to better communicate and frame our work. I was actually glad when Secretary Rubio was first nominated and was talking about safer, stronger, more prosperous. My team, we were like, great, that's exactly what we do. So let's get together. Let's get started on our talking points for briefing the new incoming leadership at USAID about how our work is making America safer, stronger, more prosperous. And we didn't have that chance, and it would have fallen on deaf ears. I know now it wouldn't have mattered, but we have been trying to do that. We've tried to frame information integrity as a national security defense issue as part of defense diplomacy and development. We've to the point where I was uncomfortable, especially 2016, 2017, about the framing of countering disinformation, so it's not easy in terms of framing the work that we do, and we've tried different approaches, and I think just ultimately it's about connecting with people on the ground as to how freedom of expression and independent information, how it's information as a public good, how it makes their lives better. And how it reflects their concerns and their voices and their issues. I think that's just making it as local as possible in that sense is really the best way going forward.
Good. I think now it's my turn to close us off and say goodbye. So if there's, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for your thoughtful questions that you submitted. If there's one thing that I kind of take away from today's call, it's that civil society and our allied partners, if you will, have a huge task ahead of us in trying to defend and strengthen freedom of expression. And at a time where global power structures are shifting, where funding infrastructure is evolving, where there's tensions and conflict and war and genocide, and a real threat that's posed to the life and liberty of journalists, of human rights defenders, and of others, I'm, today really again reminded why I joined the board of Article 19 in the first place. We know that those who kind of want to do away with freedom of expression are globally coordinated, they support each other, and they use the same playbooks. And if there was ever a time where civil society has to do the same thing and more, it is now. And so I'm really hopeful about the, ambitious work that Article 19 and our partners and other organizations everywhere in the world are going to do to safeguard and to strengthen our rights and our freedoms. And before I say goodbye, I should tell you where you can find the report. So you can find it at www.article19.org/resources/targeted. That is the title of the report. And this is where you can find the full information. And as always, please be in touch with us to discuss any of these findings or how we might be able to collaborate in the future. Thank you all so much and have a good rest of the week. Bye.